what's happening? What's happening to our faces, to your faces? When we thought that facial growth was genetic, well, it just happened. So you didn't need an explanation. But when we realized there's a strong, if not overwhelming, environmental influence to how your face grows, then we need an explanation. The pathological process by which this occurs. Let's look back. So I could say that I don't know if our ancestors had type 2 diabetes. I don't know if they had sleep apnea, but I could be fairly certain where their teeth were or where their teeth still are because we've got the records. And this is clearly something that's only happened in the blink of an evolutionary eye that we've had these problems. So if we look back at how our ancestors' skulls were looking there with their facial forms, we can see that they usually had excessive space for all their teeth. Most of them would have space for an extra tooth. So rather than the 32 teeth we have with our wisdom teeth, they would have something in the region of space for 36 teeth. And the teeth seem to be well aligned from when they were born to when they died. And with odd exceptions, they had pretty straight teeth all the time. There was no problem. And that's strange because in modern society, people are lucky if they've got space for 28 teeth. That's missing the wisdom teeth. And a lot of people not only have their wisdom teeth extracted, but they have another tooth taken out so that they can have the remaining teeth straightened up to make space for the remaining teeth. To be really clear, the profession doesn't even pretend to know why this change has occurred. There's been this huge change. The profession admits that it doesn't know why. So this is clearly an open question we should be probing. Imagine someone walking off the African Serengeti. We've got someone here who stands up beautifully, okay? They stand with their mouth shut, breathing through the nose. As a general rule, most indigenous populations alive today have pretty straight teeth. They've got straight teeth and big, broad arches of big smiles. They've got all of their teeth, and they have really good facial architecture, facial form. And it's not just them, it's the grandparents, it's the aunts, the uncles, it's the whole tribal group. So it's how we were. You know, it's the same when we look at our ancestors. Our ancestors had really very similar craniofacial structure, you know, facial and head structure. So there's been this progressive shift. Why? What's been going on? We've got this big change. Well, one of the potential problems is, or suspects, is that we've gone from this massively rough, hard, tough diet to modern junk. You know, you don't hardly need to make any effort to gain your calories in the modern world. It's easy calories for low effort. You know, I did a little bit of research before I started this, and I saw that a Starbucks cafe mocha is rated at 370 calories. Well, give one of those to your growing child, and they've got 25% of their daily calorie, not nutrition, I know, just calorific requirement. Now, that means a lot less chewing. They've got 25% less chewing because you don't need to chew to drink something. Now, go back 1,000 years. Before we had any of these refined foods or high calorific items, sugar even. To get 370 calories was some hard work. You had some chewing to do. And that's before you think of processing, you know, for leather processing and a lot of other food processing you would do with your jaws. So we've had this massive, I mean, it's difficult to describe what a big change in the usage of these muscles. And of course, we also seem to have this rapid rise in allergies. You know, this isn't really my subject, but it's clear and obvious. And one interesting thing I see is these peanut allergies and other things that just didn't exist when I was a kid. And of course, when I was at school, I was the asthmatic. There was one in my year, that was me. And it's just crazy. I talk to friends at school, and you know, a moving, veritable pharmacy is being taken in and out of school every day. Something's up, but it's not my area. But if you've got a blocked nose from an allergy, you've got two options. Option one, pack up your bags and die. Option two, well, you're going to separate your lips. You're going to lower your tongue off the roof of your mouth, open your mouth, and become a mouth breather. Now, when the issue has passed, when you can breathe again through your nose, you may or may not become a nose breather again. But a lot of people are going to continue to leave their tongue low and their mouth open. So what they've changed is their posture. So as much as changing the breathing, they've changed their posture. And I know this whole mouth breathing thing, we're having a real resurgence of interest, and it's become a sort of insult word. That's fascinating for many reasons to me. But what I'm simply saying is that if you have weak muscles and you're hanging your mouth open because for whatever reason, wherever you're breathing, this is now your new postural habit, then your face can lengthen. So if you've seen anyone who's had a stroke, and if you've got weak muscles, you're hanging mouth down, your face can just drop down. And what I'm suggesting is happening is almost like a bilateral, so a two-sided stroke is happening to the modern population. It's a little bit like you've got a little child's toy. I've got one here. So you've got a child's toy and you stretch it like this. You've only got so much head. If your head is going to get longer, it's going to get thinner and it's going to get shallower. So you reduce your cross-sectional area. You reduce the space for your teeth, so there's less space for the teeth, they're more likely to get crowded. But of course, you're also reducing the space for the airway, and you're changing the general structure, so it gets a little bit more complicated. I've got an illustration here. Now, if you have your tongue on the roof of your mouth, okay, and you're biting hard together frequently with high loading, then I'm going to estimate your face is more likely to grow straight forward. Now, if you're hanging your mouth open and you've got weak muscles, well, I'm going to guesstimate that your face is more likely to grow downwards. Now, one of the interesting things we notice is how then the jaw changes shape slightly, because there's only one. This is a busy area, and so it needs to change because you can't have the angle of the mandible hitting the airway. Yeah, I can't do it. No, impossible. So you get changes in the shape of the mandible as well, and you get this classic pattern of a face that grows downwards. Now, here's an illustration of a girl I treated here, Jenny. And what's really interesting about Jenny is if you were to reverse these two pictures, that would be giving a good illustration of what I think goes wrong. And by gaining better growth with Jenny, she's demonstrating how things can then go right when you treat someone correctly, and they work hard to gain that change themselves. Now, here we've got a 3D image because we're in the 3D world, and this gives a graphic illustration of how faces are dropping down in modern society. You know, people get a bit upset when I talk about this because, you know, it's very personal. I mean, your facial form is possibly the most personal it can ever get. Now, if I mention to the mother of this child that her face has lengthened, she has good grounds to be upset with me, because this is a child she loves, and she loves how she looks, because that's her daughter. However, if I then treated this child as I did and said, oh, now your daughter's face used to be longer, and now we've got it more forward, more horizontal, I think she would agree with me. Now, we tend to hide this change. You don't see this change. There was a researcher called Marcotte, and he did some research in 1981, and what he noticed was that most humans always hold this point here above this point here. Okay, don't worry about the actual anatomical places, but he noticed that we always hold these 2 points here. And my suggestion is that if your face doesn't grow, ideally, we're social animals and you want to present your best face forward. So often this vertical growth pattern is hidden. So here we have an illustration of a woman who well, she looks normal, doesn't she? She looks like an average person you're going to meet in the street today. This could easily be you. Now, when you take an x-ray of her skull, you'll notice she's got cervical changes. You know, she's potentially going to have neck problems because she's craning her neck backwards like this. And then if I were to draw a line down so we get a real illustration of this vertical I mentioned earlier on, and I was to tip her head, recorrect the head angle, so untip the head that she's done to illustrate to you just how much the face has changed, we look like this. So here's how we're hiding this problem with a compensatory head tip. Here's an illustration of someone who has muscular dystrophy. You can see the x-ray, it's taken from the side, and over the top of this x-ray, you've got a normal modern. So it's a modern, normal tracing. Okay, so you've got the lines. This gives you some illustration of just how far this face has melted back and down. It's a little bit like, it's a waxwork model. Someone's got a little bit too close to the fire and it's literally melted down and back. You know, I know we're talking about someone's face, but there is nothing wrong with the bones in muscular dystrophy. It's the muscle, it's the plate junctions, but it's not the bones. The bones aren't at fault here, okay? And as this face has dropped all the way down, of course, as I mentioned, we've got less space for the teeth, we've got less space for the tongue, and we've got less space for the airway. Here are two images. This is an image, this is an image taken at this level through using a CT scan. And what you can see when you're, that's not a CT, it's MRI, I think. So when you're looking at this, you can see we've got the airway highlighted. And then if I was to ask you which one of these two individuals had been the more vertical grower, I think we would agree that the person on the right-hand side has grown more vertically. Because as the face lengthens and we reduce the cross-sectional area, there is only so much stuff that's compressible. So you get a magnified effect on the airway. And that's the real problem here. You know, we can talk about crooked teeth, but generally it's not, you're not going to die of crooked teeth, but you will die from sleep apnea. That's a problem. And of course, there's the old phrase, if you're snoring today, you're likely to have sleep apnea tomorrow. And that when you look at the research overview, one of the most statistically significant indicators to whether you're going to get sleep apnea is the measurement from the back of the airway to where the tongue comes in here. Okay, that horizontal measurement. The bigger that horizontal measurement, the less likely you are to get sleep apnea. It's just a general overview. And of course, as your face drops down, you're more likely to get sleep apnea because this area is dropping back. And of course, pushing your tongue down into your airway. And when you lie down to go to sleep at night, that's gonna become a bigger problem just because of gravity. It's interesting how sleep apnea is being treated. You've got a range of different methods, from nasal strips to oral devices in the mouth to these CPAP machines. Now, my big worry about these CPAP machines is the big elastic band that runs around the back of the head. Because there is a risk that over time, these will pull the face back and down further, which is it's scary. It's a risk. It's my concern. When we look at what we call a sagittal section, looking into, now this isn't an ancient skull here, comparing an ancient skull with a modern skull. This is just a pre-industrial skull to a modern skull. And what you can see is the vast difference in architecture. It's just got a huge nasal space in the pre-industrial to, well, we call that normal. But when you look at the one on the left, you're gonna think this is getting really quite small. This is a problem. You know, we're getting lots of ENT or otolaryngology in the US problems. We get deviated nasal septums, we get sinusitis, we're getting glue ear, otitis media, and tonsillitis. I'll come to that one in a second. But all of these problems from a structure A structure that's not the right shape is unlikely to work as well as a structure that is the right shape. And if we think that that nasal cavity on the right hand side is normal, then I think we're losing our way, because we've got to remember what normal used to be, not what normal is now, and those are two potentially different definitions. When we're talking otitis media, we're talking locked eustachian tubes, glue ear, as we say in the UK. This is an interesting problem. You've got a tube that goes from inside the back of the throat through to the ear. The idea is every time you swallow correctly and you open this tube. Well, if we've got very different architecture, if you don't have space to place your tongue on the roof of the mouth and swallow correctly, and then you don't swallow correctly because you haven't had the right food or breastfeeding when you're young, which is another issue we won't cover today, then you're likely to get that tube blocked. And if you get that tube blocked, you can get some problems. But it's likely to be blocked more frequently because of this great change in architecture and great change in function. So these are more downstream effects of a head that's not the right shape. And of course, then we move on to temporomandibular disorders. So problems with the jaw joints. There was Zoe Ball, a popular UK DJ who recently gave up her slot. She retired effectively because of jaw joint problems. And this can be an absolutely debilitating problem. I won't go into it now, but here is another problem with faces that aren't growing properly, that aren't the right shape, that needs a lot more investigation into it. And of course, these changes aren't new. You see, going back many thousand years, those living on milk and honey would get changes. You see these very, I would assume they're very accurately created busts, carvings of ancient leaders. These are all wealthy. This is the aristocracy. These are the people who could afford to they had a privileged life. They had a soft life. They were the first groups affected. And there's this very interesting, what I would refer to as retro-attractiveness. That these people looked dignified, they looked noble, they looked educated. And of course, this was the minority. And this is another subject we could look at, I have looked at, where we say things have changed. We always want what is in scarcity. But I think one of the important things to look, I'm illustrating here, is that as the top jaw drops down and back further and further and further, initially it leaves the nose proud. You get lack of support under the eyes. The nose looks larger because you get flat cheekbones, but eventually, as this progresses, the cartilaginous section of the nose gets pulled back, leaving just the bony section, that section above here, unaffected. The rest of it gets pulled back, and you end up with a lump just here on your nose. And when you look at individuals with lumps on their noses, they very rarely have high cheekbones, and they usually have a generally larger looking nose. As things change, they don't change in the same way for everyone. So you still have to breathe, you have to swallow, eat, you have to talk, and you're going to rest and do whatever else functions you do with your mouth. And there are only so many places you can place your tongue so that you can do all of those things, particularly breathing, because, well, at the end of the day, that's possibly the most important thing in your life. And to breathe, you're going to make modifications. Now, what I'm suggesting is that many people may respond to this downswinging facial form, these changes, by resting their tongue evenly between their teeth. So they take some of the bulk of the tongue up out of the airway so that they can breathe more easily, and place the tongue evenly between their teeth. And this is going to create this pattern of change. As you see, this is a balanced downswing. So in this way, the whole face drops down in a balanced way, and it leads to a balanced dental occlusion or dental malocclusion if it goes excessively, where all the teeth meet up. The top and bottom teeth are in a balanced, we would refer to as correct, from what we call the angles classification, arrangement. Now, that is probably the most common way people go wrong. Now, the next most common way people go wrong would be what we refer to as a class 2 situation. And I think this is where people put their tongue forward and hang it forward. They displace their tongue forward and hang their mouth open. So they displace the tongue forward, mouth open. As this occurs, the bottom jaw drops down and back to an exaggerated amount, because that's how they're resting and holding that position. That's their postural position. And then finally, to cover the major classifications, we would have a class 3 position. And this is another very effective response, a very effective way of maintaining a good airway and good function. And what you can do, you can drop your tongue in your bottom jaw and you can hold your jaw forwards like this. It's comfortable. It opens up my airway. It's a great response to this environmental insult upon me and changes in structure so that I could breathe properly. And we see these different patterns in different places in the world. And of course, people would love to think this was genetic. There's a real need for, I'd just love to see the evidence. You know, the evidence seems to stack up that this is the environment. It's just largely ignored evidence. And of course, what I'm suggesting is this is very much old, flat earth thinking. People are thinking, well, you've got your class 1s here, your class 2s, you know, your undershot jaws, you've got your class 3s with the underbites here, and you know, you've got to shuffle it backwards and forwards. And largely, that's what modern orthodontics was doing, or has been doing. We're trying to move this back. And I'm trying to introduce a totally new paradigm to say that, okay, well, we've got these modern normals we refer to, but actually the ideal position is having the face up where the hunter-gatherers had their faces, where these indigenous populations, where our ancestors had their faces, which is the whole face further up and forward. So ideal would be here. You would drop down to class 1, you would drop down like this to class 2, and you would drop down like this to class 3. So this is flat world thinking. We've missed these great vertical and rotational changes. I started this craze, inadvertently started this craze. It was not my intention. And yet in retrospect, what would young people do if they knew what I've just told you? Well, clearly they're going to jump at gaining change themselves, and it works. They do gain change themselves, and really this is kind of proof in the pudding. And here are just several illustrations. People, I don't know these people. I've just taken these images off the internet, so I've had no influence in any of these people here. But they seem to have gained, well, either they're lying or it's Photoshop, but they seem to have gained a lot of changes, and there are thousands upon thousands of images like this. Now, this image here is one of the more interesting. Here's someone displaying what appears to be a large amount of change. Now, what's really interesting is he has got some good quality x-rays, 3-dimensional x-rays, and he goes into great detail to analyze this and demonstrate how much he's changed. Now, either this is a total hoax, he's totally making it all up, or maybe he has gained substantial structural change as a non-growing adult. Now that is really interesting. Then we've got this I will mention this guy's Astro Sky. So I've been talking to Astro Sky, so I met him, not right at the beginning, but not that long after the beginning, and he showed me small amounts of change, and I was impressed, and we chatted, and so I've seen him gain the rest of this change. So here's an individual, I've not met him in person, but I've met him online, and either I'm lying or would it appear to be he's gained substantial change in form just from applying the reverse principles of this pathological process. And I like science where you see it going wrong because of one problem you identify, and then you correct it by making a change, and you see the reverse pattern. That seems to be relatively sound science. And of course, we can ask, well, what is mewing? Well, realistically, mewing is good oral posture and function and good body posture and function. It's really not complicated. I think more or less anyone could do it, and I'm gonna make a blatant advert for it at the end because it is the sponsor of this channel. But effectively it's saying lips together, teeth together, tongue on the roof of the mouth, which is the tropic premise that my father came up with many years ago. And also it's stand up straight and shut your mouth, eat with your mouth shut. There is nothing new. Confucius was saying this 2,500 years ago, and the Victorians were saying it 150 years ago. It's exactly the same message. I'll never forget, many years ago, I had a patient came in to see me, and they brought the grandmother along. And clear, I've seen this many times, and the inference here is they're hoping the grandmother might get behind the treatment and fund it, pay for it. And I started to explain this to the mother, and I was explaining this, stand up straight, shut your mouth, and eat with your mouth shut, upon which the grandmother suddenly pipes up, turns around to the mother, and goes, "I told you this when you were young, if you'd only listened." And then the grandmother turns around and goes, "Cool, yes, we'll have the treatment, thank you very much." It was the most bizarre situation. But this is not new knowledge. It's as old as the hills. We're reinventing the wheel. I'm just codifying it, analysing it, and to understand it a little bit better and, giving some good tips and hints. That's what the app is all about. Now, I want to delve a little bit deeper into that airway issue, because that's the big one. That's, you type in airway orthodontics. What I'm describing here is an integrated pathological process, but elements of it seem to have gone stratospheric. They've become suddenly very popular. My father was treating airways in the 80s, probably before quite a few of these people now, and yet we were even born. But clearly airways are important, and that's one of the areas this was expanded greatly. Now, here's an image of someone from an ancestral population, a skull from an ancestral population looking in the airway, and a modern skull, clearly a modern skull missing some teeth. And you can see the great change that's occurred in the nasal airway. Reflect back on that the nasal airway I showed you before. And here's looking up underneath the skull, and the changes that are going on here as the face downswings. That's going to affect the airway. And I think that one thing really interesting in this is when you look at the surgery, there's lots of different ways of treating sleep apnea, as we discussed earlier on. But many people, surgeons in particular, would think that the gold standard treatment would be to move the face forwards and potentially upwards. Or, well, at least not increase the vertical too much. And there's debate about this. But this is almost validating what I'm saying. And here's a really nice example of someone whose face has been moved forwards. Clearly, this is oversimplifying it massively. You also got to look at the nasal airway, which is, again, part of the problem we're talking about. But if this changes are improving airways, then that helps validate the whole process we're talking about. Now, of course, what this process also does is it makes people look better. And there is that's a double-edged sword, isn't it? That thing, that it makes people look better. People with better looking faces are healthier. It's a message many people don't want to hear, particularly if your face hasn't grown well. And sometimes I wish we could get, we didn't have that in this field, because yes, it's made the mewing revolution go forward. However, in many other ways, it has held me back. Thank you for taking the time to get to this point of the video. Next, I'm going to make an advert for the Mewing app. I think it's worth hearing, but I just want to make a call out here that the whole purpose of this channel is to get engagement and debate. These areas have just not been investigated, and I think we should start with the debate on why teeth are crooked. If we've got a profession that's treating 50% of the population openly admitting they don't know the cause, well then we should get in and have a debate, because that's the scientific process. That's normal, everyday scientific process. I'm not asking for any more than that, but that's really what I want help and support to gain, because you really need it. This is an area that really needs further investigation. It needs science. It needs good medical science and the spotlight of modern medical research to focus on this, to see how we can make it better, in particularly how we could prevent these problems as all our ancestors did, and it must be possible today. And a word from our sponsor, the Mewing app. We know that teeth sit in a balance between the lips and the cheeks on the outside and the tongue on the inside. That's not in question. That's everyone in dentistry is in a complete agreement with that. But it is vital for everyone to try to improve this balance, to align your own teeth, to make orthodontic treatment faster and more effective, and to minimize or prevent relapse after treatment, or possibly even to gain a total upswing in facial form. It's not easy, but that's your goal, or at least prevent a downswing, which is really important. Now, this is little more than the inside information on stand up straight and shut your mouth, as I covered earlier on. These exercises have been shown to reduce the measurements of sleep apnea, which another thing we should have covered, by 50% in adults and 62% in children. So that's validation that these are useful exercises, and they're in this app. Now, many of you will struggle as you lack tongue space, or you already have too serious a problem. And the best and probably the only way to get you the help that you deserve is to help us get the spotlight of modern medical research to focus squarely on this area. Our mission with this channel, and sponsored by the Mewing app, is to gain debate on the cause and work up, with the most immediate application being prevention. So no kids should have malocclusion, crooked teeth, or any of these associated problems for facial development. I know that's controversial, but it shouldn't happen. So good facial bone structure is all of our birthright. Faces which grow well, work well, and through simple public health messaging and simple, cheap habits, we believe that we can make a real difference. Now, I'm asking you to support us directly with the GoFundMe link underneath, or indirectly while helping yourself with the Mewing app. It's also linked below. And then finally, we're looking for volunteers, because we need to create a movement for change. And please join that movement for change. There's also a link down below. So thank you very much for taking the time to get to this point of the video. Perfect.